Welcome everyone to another stream. It's been a couple of months since I did the last one, although we had a good conversation with Nathan on digital gnosis. Have a look at that if you're interested. I've already forgotten what we covered. It was something interesting, I'm sure. Anyway, hopefully there'll be another Bad Apologetics soon. I think we're going to do one on culture wars stuff. But today I asked the people, what did the people want? And the people have spoken. And the people want more near-death experiences. I don't really know why, because near-death experiences are so silly. But then when the competition is demons and culture war, I mean, it's sort of all pretty silly. So we're going to do another video on near-death experiences. And ask and you shall deliver, or no, ask and I shall deliver. Ask and you shall receive. That's the one I'm thinking of. And Capturing Christianity has delivered. And now I'm delivering on his deliverance. I don't know what the hell I'm saying. I'm just trying to get the video up here. No, wrong way. No, there we go. Okay. Welcome all in chat. Hopefully we'll get people joining in. So this video was from a couple of weeks ago, where actually, maybe I'll just exit full screen, where Cameron spoke with Dr. Michael Sabom. I'm not sure if I've encountered some of his work before. The name is somewhat familiar. Nathan and I did a whole many hour-long Bad Apologetic stream on near-death experiences a couple of years back, so you can consult that. I am sure I will go through many of the same points there, although hopefully some new ones will occur to me as well. Now, I have not watched this video yet. I decided that we'll just go in and, see what we pick up on a first viewing, in part because I just find this stuff infuriating, especially looking at the timestamps. We've got Pam Reynolds there. That's always a good one. Lack of evidence, the afterlife. Oh, those nasty skeptics. Press studies. Oh gosh, this is going to be a fun one. It looks like there's some kind of movie that they're promoting as well. I guess we'll see what that's about. Anyway, apparently near-death experiences are evidence for Christianity in some way. So I guess let's find out.
Hey, and welcome to Capturing Christianity. I've got a really exciting show for you today. We're talking about near-death experiences. I'm talking with a cardiologist. His name is Dr. Michael Sabom. Did I pronounce that correctly? Sabom?
Close enough.
Close enough. Well, he's a cardiologist. He's a confessing Christian, and he's a near-death experience researcher. He also appeared in the film After Death, which just premiered, I think, on October 27th. Today is November 2nd, so it's still in theaters if you guys are interested in going and watching that. And Dr. Sabom is in the actual film himself. He's one of the interviewees, and he's also written a couple books on the subject: Recollections of Death, a medical investigation, and Light and Death, one doctor's fascinating account of near-death experiences. So that's what we're talking about today on the channel: near-death experiences. The first thing that I'd like to ask you, Dr. Sabom, is what is your background as a cardiologist, and then how did that lead you into starting to research into the area of near-death experiences?
Well, my background is mainly medical. Went to medical school in Galveston, Texas, and then did some training in the University of Florida prior to being drafted into the Army for a couple of years. Came back, and I was doing my cardiology residency at the University of Florida, and a psychiatric social worker in the hospital that I was working with showed me a book in 1975. It was Raymond Moody's first book, Life After Life, and I'll be quite honest with you, I thought it was hogwash. I had never heard of these experiences before. I actually even went into the hospital and asked other older physicians whether they had heard of them, and they had not. So I was quite skeptical of the whole thing.
The good old canard, the avowal of prior skepticism. I'm sure he was very skeptical and exercised all of the sorts of skeptical faculties and techniques that you would expect a genuine skeptic to use when approaching a topic that they're a bit concerned about, whether it's real or not. So let's see if we find actual evidence of that, or whether this may be just the sort of thing that one always hears with these sorts of accounts. Oh, I was super skeptical at first. See where this goes.
And Sarah, who is a psychiatric social worker, was presenting a presentation on Moody's book to a Methodist Sunday school class, and asked me to go ask a few of my patients whether they had had this experience. And I was very reluctant to do that, but she twisted my arm long enough, so I finally gave up and did it. And the third patient I interviewed had a classic near-death experience, as Moody had described in his book. Now, Moody's book, he admits this in writing in the book, it was not a scientific study. He had interviewed approximately 50 people, and they had given him these stories that he he coined the term near-death experience, and I think he had 12 or some features in the stories that then became what's known as the classic near-death experience. Anyway, the presentation by Sarah went well. Afterwards, we got together. We thought that maybe we ought to look into this further. She convinced me to do that, and so we set about making a scientific study protocol in which we interviewed patients, tape recorded the interviews, collected a lot of background data, and of course, got details, medical records or whatever, to document the experience itself.
Or whatever.
As a cardiologist, I was interested in seeing
that.
whether or not these were really actual experiences. And the way I did that was to pay particular attention.
What do you mean they were actual experiences? If someone was in the hospital and they had some kind of operation, and then afterwards they report, "Oh, I had so-and-so experience, this thing happened, or I remember this." I mean, that's an experience, right? What's the difference between an actual experience and a non-actual experience? I mean, the only thing I can think of is if the person just completely lied and didn't actually have any of those experiences, they just made it up afterwards. And I don't think there are too many people who are actually saying that all of these things are just purely invented after the fact. The question is not whether these experiences are real. They're experiences, right? The question is, what is the cause of these experiences? And of course, that's where we're going to get into questions about whether there are natural explanations for these experiences, which spoilers, of course, there are. And we don't need to invent two extremely implausible, concocted, non-natural explanations of. But I expect we'll see that in this video, that they can't help themselves. But anyway, it's important to understand what the real issue is here. It's not whether the experiences are sort of real. The question is what causes them. What's the reality that underpins them? Why do people have these experiences? So bear that in mind, that's the real question here.
To what I termed at the time the autoscopic, which is a word meaning self-visualization, part of the experience. That's the typical out-of-body experience where they float up out of their body when they're unconscious and near death, and they see details, they see things that are going on. And as a cardiologist, I said, well, this is an easy thing to find out one way or the other, whether the details they're seeing are actually real and accurate. And very surprisingly, the people that I talked.
Okay, he's jumping the gun a bit here. So the classical near-death experience, well, I mean, there's a wide range of things that people report. It's not that standardized. And part of the issue is that people's reports tend to be contaminated with things that they've heard or seen in media, as well as things that people tell them after the fact, which then changes their account. So it's a bit difficult, especially because often these accounts are reported months to years afterwards. So there's plenty of time for memory distortions and contamination. I'm sure as a skeptic, that's something that Dr. What is it again? Sabom. That's how Cameron said it, so I'll just go with that. I'm sure as a skeptic, that's something Dr. Sabom considered, but I guess we'll hear more about that in a moment. But anyway, what is common, at least in these reports, is that people, while they're undergoing some kind of operation, will report after the fact an experience of them seeing themselves from outside of their body, so from on the roof or across the room or something like that, seeing things happening to them during the operation, and sometimes also hearing things happen, hearing people saying things in the room. And sometimes there are also accounts of lights or going down a tunnel or encountering angelic or even demonic beings, but that's not always present. And the aspect that is being mentioned here of people seeing things in the room or hearing things in the operating room or the hospital room is of relevance, of course, because if people report experiencing things or seeing or hearing things that they should not have been able to see or hear because they were unconscious at the time, then that could provide evidence as to the nature of these experiences. And so that's sort of what's being appealed to here, is that the reports, the content of the reports of the experiences can tell us something about the nature of the experiences. So, for example, if there's no way that someone could have seen with their actual eyes what happened in the room because they were unconscious at the time, or there was something covering their eyes or whatever else, then plausibly or presumably the information contained in that report that the patient provided afterwards did not come actually through the senses, like through the eyes. It must have come through some other means, right? Of course, then the further question is, well, what means could there be? We'll get into that, but we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves here. The claim is that we can use the content of the experiences to make inferences about the cause of the experiences. And so let's pay attention to the reasoning or like the reasoning steps that go into that and what evidence is presented. So that's what we're doing here.
Were very honest about it, and a few of them could.
Who was honest about it?
Whether the details you're seeing are actually real and accurate. And very surprisingly, the people that I talked to were very honest about it, and
I assume he means the patients here. I don't know how he knows they were honest about it. Maybe he'll explain.
A few of them could come up with details that were very accurate, very unique to the situation that had happened, and they were out of the physical view of the patient as they were lying there unconscious being resuscitated.
Yeah, so the point here is that people reported seeing things that they would not have been able to see at that time because they were unconscious or that they were obscured from their view in some other way. Okay, let's see where we go with this.
So I then looked into possible explanations of how this could happen. How could somebody see something from out of an out-of-body location, and then later you could go back and show that what they had seen actually had occurred? I put all.
Okay, so we already see here that Sabom's not a very good skeptic. He failed at 5 minutes in. Okay, so the good skeptic will take the observation, the evidence, the phenomena to be explained, which is reports of seeing things which the patient would not have been able to see at that time. That's the thing to be explained. Explanandum, we might say. What are possible explanations of this? Well, a very obvious explanation is that people very often report things that they didn't see themselves. It's because they found out the information after the fact, like someone told them, or they inferred it themselves, or they saw a picture of something and then confused it with the thing, with the experience that they had. I mean, that's there's sort of a spectrum here between being wrong and actually forming false memories, but regardless of exactly what we call it, the point is that someone can come to have believed that they saw something that they didn't actually see at the time. And and here's the crucial point, the information about information that they couldn't have seen at the time could have easily reached them through other means, like after the fact. That's not at all difficult. It's like if I know what happens when I was asleep after the fact, I say, oh, this thing happened while I was asleep. The most obvious inference is that somehow I found out after I woke up, right? That doesn't take a genius to work out. Oh, they must have found out somehow, whether they worked it out just by piecing things together that they knew, or whether someone told them, or whether they formed a sort of a false memory by a combination of factors that the correct information leaked in there somehow. Maybe it's a combination of things. It's no one thing. Whatever it is, it's not difficult for someone to find out something that they didn't know at the time, right? Like when they were unconscious. That's the most straightforward explanation. And so in order to rule that out as a possibility, which I think Sabom wants to do, we have to be sure that there is no reasonable opportunity for the person to have found out the information that they supposedly couldn't have known after the fact. So what we have is a reporting time, and then earlier than that there was an experience time, like during the operation or whatever. In between that time, we have to make sure that there was no contamination of evidence about whatever it was that they were not supposed to know, directly or indirectly, in part or in whole. Like, it doesn't have to be full information. Even partial information could be reconstructed by the patient, right? So we need to rule that out, and that requires very careful, controlled conditions, which typically are obviously not in place in these medical environments, because their focus is on making the patient well and not on conducting a controlled scientific study. Although there have been some studies that have attempted to do this. Maybe I'll talk about those later. So the point is here that we have an issue of information that was not supposed to be available to the patient, but being reported by the patient. The obvious explanation is that that information was available to them at some point between the operation and when they reported it. And the question is, how do we rule out that information being provided to them in some way, or being worked out, inferred by them in some way? Let's hear what Dr. Sabom has to say about how he ruled out this class of explanations.
All of this in the book, along with the data, and published it in 1982, I believe. But this is this is part of the experience that really hooked me on continuing the investigation. There was something going on here that could not be explained by normal scientific process, and I was determined to find out perhaps what that might indicate or be. So that's how I got into the whole thing of near-death experiences.
There's about 1,000 questions rolling around in my brain right now.
Well, I guess he'll get to it in a moment, but that's going to be my open question. How do we rule out that information being provided to the patient or being worked out by the patient between when the report is made and when the incident initially occurred. So maybe in Pam Reynolds, when we get to that, that's a very well-known case. We'll hear more about this.
I'd like to ask you about. I'm trying to narrow in on just one. As you were talking about these experiences that you've had, you've done this research personally, you've interviewed people personally. How many would you say of these folks that have had a near-death experience, how many of them recall accurate data on these what was the term, autoscopic? These autoscopic experiences, how many of them reported accurate information, and how many reported, inaccurate information, that it just didn't make any sense, it didn't line up with what was actually happening in the room?
So this requires a way of comparing what the patient reports with the fact of the matter, during when the experience allegedly took place, or like the procedure took place. Now that will be possible in some cases and not in others. It depends on the level of granularity. Some things will be easier to verify than others. Some things will be very specific to that particular setup. Others will be more general procedures and things that are easier to verify. And also, it's going to depend on how long after the event that it's reported. So if the report occurs days, even hours after the event, that's pretty easy to verify. You sort of go back into the room and check photographs or whatever. Other things, might be harder to check, especially the further you go in time after the event. It's going to be more difficult to verify exactly what happened and exactly which people did what and where the furniture was and like whatever other details are being recalled. So, we need to exercise some caution there about how the facts were verified, in addition to how the patient could have plausibly come to know of those facts. So we need to make sure that we have quality evidence on two fronts. First of all, we need to make sure that the facts reported by the patient are actually correct, like they line up with the way things were in that operating room or in that facility at that time. So we have to have independent verification of that, apart from just the patient. Obviously, we need to check it against some objective source, which should be, accurate and verifiable. So that's one issue. The second issue is we need to ensure that there was no plausible way that the patient could have gained access to that information after the fact, like between the procedure and the report of the procedure. These are the two key things that need to be controlled or checked in order to establish that there's anything possible that's sort of supernatural or supernormal going on here. I mean, even if we can establish those, it doesn't automatically mean that there's anything supernatural, of course, but at least that's where we can establish that there's something interesting going on. There's an effect, so to speak. So again, bear those two in mind. How do we objectively establish what the facts were during the procedure? And then how do we establish that the patient didn't have any means between the experience and the report of that experience of gaining access to that information?
Great question. Of the 116, there were 32 who had an autoscopic portion of their near-death experience. Of the 32, only 6 had specific details where I could go back and find and show and verify the accuracy of. The other majority of these autoscopic experiences were quite vague, quite general, and they were not incorrect, but they didn't have any details that would be unique to verify that.
Well, so how do you know they were? How does he know they were incorrect if there was no way for him to verify any details? I guess if we're being charitable, what we should understand him to be saying is that he doesn't have any specific evidence that they were incorrect, which is fine if you can't check either way. But you shouldn't say they weren't wrong. You should say you can't check either way. Anyway, that's maybe a nitpick. But for someone who declares himself to be a skeptic at the outset, I expect a little bit more, clarity and precision there about what you can and cannot verify.
That they had actually seen it from out of their body. For instance, a patient would say something like, well, I saw the doctor do, and the nurse come in and they're standing around my bed, and that sort of general thing that could be.
Anybody could say that.
They were non-specific. What I was looking for are specific details, things that were unique to the situation that I knew had happened and I could document, and were out of a physical view of the patient as they were lying there in bed. So it's important to point out also that with a cardiac arrest, and most of these patients were cardiac arrest patients, with a bona fide cardiac arrest, you lose consciousness. It's been shown in multiple studies that consciousness is lost and the EEG is flat within 15 to 20 seconds after the onset of the flatline arrhythmia. And so what we're dealing here with in a hospital, there's no way you can resuscitate a patient within 15 seconds of the start of the arrhythmia unless you're standing right there, which all these patients were either in a room somewhere in the ICU. But just the same, just to get the equipment over there, hooked up, ready to go, 15 seconds is not possible. So they were unconscious, according to this period of time. It was during a period of time when they were unconscious and obviously near death.
What he said there is extremely unclear. So he said it was during a period of time when the patient was unconscious and near death. Well, if they're not breathing and they have no brain activity, well, if you're not breathing, you're not going to have brain activity. And especially if they're at room temperature, then I suppose it's fair to say that they were near death, although that is sort of ambiguous, especially because death is not precisely medically defined. There's clinical death, which has certain, is mainly cessation of breathing and heart rate, cessation of heartbeat and breathing. And I think that there's a few other criteria that they look at, but that's not the same thing as actual biological death, because clinical death is reversible with resuscitation, but biological death is not reversible. Anyway, we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. I'm just emphasizing that the notion of near death is vague. But the real issue here is he said that it occurred when they were unconscious and near death. It's not clear what he means by it. I guess he means the events that are reported by the patients or the people who experience the near-death experience. But that's going to be an important issue, right? Because there'll be a period of time before consciousness was lost and then a period of time after consciousness is regained. Of course, it's not a binary thing. You sort of may gradually, I don't know what it's like after a cardiac arrest, but at least when I've been under anesthesia or fainted or other things, or even waking up after sleep, that you sort of can phase back into consciousness sort of progressively. And you might not remember consciously everything that happens in the interim, but there's still maybe ability for information to be received and stored there, but maybe in a way that you don't fully comprehend or perceive correctly what happened. But anyway, there's some fuzziness at the edges, but there's some period of time between when consciousness was lost and when it was regained, right? And the question is whether the event that the patient claims to have seen occurred in that time, because if it occurred outside of that time, well, it's not that interesting. I mean, they saw it or heard it, right? Using normal means. To rule that out, we have to be sure that the event occurred during the time when they were unconscious. And I guess that's what we're being told here, is that the events that they're reporting did occur during that time. But we need very precise records of when exactly that was, which should be available if we have medical records. But that's something that needs to be checked.
So some people in the comments are asking, is this the guy that was in the movie After Death? Yes, this is Dr. Sabom from the movie After Death, which just released in theaters on October 27th. It is currently in theaters if you're watching this live, or if you're watching it a couple weeks after it premiered. Otherwise, you may be able to pick it up over at Angel Studios or wherever else they've got it available for you. But the movie is called After Death. So the next question that I've got for you is, what is, like, in your research?
Thank you, modern moralist. Assuming you're talking to me and not Cameron and Sabom here. Appreciate that.
And just going far beyond like what you've personally investigated, what are some of the most compelling cases of NDEs from your research that have basically convinced you that the afterlife is real, if that is a conclusion?
Whoa, where did the afterlife come from? Who said anything about the afterlife? I thought we were talking about trying to understand the causes of near-death experiences, and maybe there's something, beyond what science currently understands or what is currently regarded as biologically possible that's going on. That's a sort of a possibility. I mean, obviously, I know the meta where the afterlife came in, but I'm just talking about from the point of view of someone approaching this, or from like an alleged skeptic. The afterlife has just come in from left field here. What does the afterlife have to do with near-death experiences? Now, there's a little hint here, right? Afterlife, okay, that's a compound word. I know this is hard to understand. After life, okay? And life is the thing that ends at death. Near-death experiences, that first word near, that means it's not actually death. Like it's sort of near it, but we're not actually dead yet. So there's a conceptual issue here. I mean, I don't know how the afterlife is supposed to work, but how I would have understood it to work is that even if you're near dead, you're still not dead, and therefore you don't go to the afterlife, or the afterlife, you don't experience that, whatever the afterlife is supposed to be. So how could anything that happens while someone is alive, even if they're near death, how could that tell us anything about the afterlife? I guess that you'd have to make some kind of claim that the afterlife kind of overlaps with the actual life and we can get glimpses into it or something like that. But already that's very speculative. And note that we haven't even looked at any near-death experience evidence, and we're just thinking conceptually about what the afterlife is supposed to be. We already have to make a bunch of kind of weird assumptions about how it works to even get off the ground the idea that someone who is not actually dead but is nearly dead can have some experience of what happens after they actually die. Like, why would you think that at all? Just imagine if we make an analog here about, it's like a near-birth experience. That someone is like nearly born, but they're not quite, and they have an experience of what it's like to have been born, but they're not born. Like that, it kind of doesn't really work like that. I mean, I know there's some unusual procedures, but putting those aside, like you're sort of born or you're not born, right? I mean, the idea of a near-birth experience of, if you imagine the newborn or near newborn going back to report what it's like to be alive based on a near-birth experience. It's like, well, how could you know? Like, you weren't actually born, like you were nearly born. But anyway, that's not a perfect analogy, but hopefully you get the point that I'm making. The idea is kind of absurd. Like, how can you find out about what happens after death without having died? Just because you got close to death, what does that have to do with anything? Who says that the afterlife works anything like that? Why would you expect it to? But maybe the argument would be, well, it's the best explanation we have, even if it's kind of wacky. Well, maybe, but let's see let's see how we can rule out the more mundane explanations that I presented at the outset. Let's
in my second study, and I'm not saying this just with my experience, but this happened in my second study and is widely considered the most well-documented case and unexplainable case on record. And that's the case of Pam Reynolds, who was a 35-year-old woman in Atlanta at the time. She had a giant basilar artery aneurysm in her head. That's up there in the head. And the neurosurgeons in Atlanta refused to operate on her because the location of the aneurysm was in such a deep and delicate position. She flew out to Phoenix, Arizona to a neurosurgeon who had developed a special type of procedure called hypothermic cardiac arrest. That's where you lower the body temperature down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The EEG is flat. Obviously, the heart is stopped. Everything was at standstill. And that's, as a matter of fact, what they call it, nicknamed standstill. When all those conditions were met, everything was at standstill. They tilted the top of the operating room table up, and she had been placed on a cardiopulmonary bypass machine, and they drained the blood out of her head so that the aneurysm could collapse, and then the surgeon could go in there and safely take it out. During this procedure, Pam had an out-of-body experience, the autoscopic part, where she was able to see and describe uniquely the bone saw. She said it looked like an electric toothbrush. And in the book, Light and Death, I have these pictures in there so you can see for yourself what I'm talking about. She described that. She described the equipment off to the side of the operating room table. And very importantly, she heard a conversation between Dr. Spetzler, who was a neurosurgeon, and a cardiovascular surgeon who was operating on her femoral artery in her groin to cannulate it so that they can remove the blood from her body. And that conversation she remembered very accurately at a time that her eyes were tape shut. She was deeply unconscious. Her EEG was flat, and she had these earbuds in both ears, and they were emitting 95 decibel clicks several times a second. There was absolutely no way she could have physically heard this conversation, but she did. And she repeated what they said at that time. Now, the reason for these earbuds in the ear was to check the brainstem activity at the time, because if there was no blip on the monitoring device of the brainstem at the time the sound was made, that meant the brainstem was flatlined also. So she was as close as you can get to death under experimental conditions that you could be. And she had this experience. And then the next day, after she was coming out of anesthesia, she started telling the assistant neurosurgeon, Carl Green, about this. And this is actually in the After Death movie. Carl Green was interviewed, and Pam was telling him about the conversation and about what was going on at the time. So there was no time lapse between waking up, talking to other people, them relaying on to her what had happened, and then she concocted it up as her own story, which is, by the way, often an excuse or an explanation for how these experiences occur and are accurate, obtaining the information from other people later. In Pam's case, that wasn't true. So,
oh boy. So I have done some reading on the Pam Reynolds case. It was a while ago now. I'm just quickly checking over some of my old notes about this. So the Pam Reynolds case has some truly devout defenders, and it's not unlikely I'll get one or two in the comments after the video who just a bit crazy about it. I find the whole thing extremely unconvincing of evidence of much of anything because it's so uncontrolled. So from the documentation I have, and I have not read Sabom's book, so forgive me. Actually, I think I might have read parts of it, come to think of it. I did buy a few books back in the day, but they all blur together. But anyway, some of the details I have available here are that Dr. Sabom interviewed Pam Reynolds 3 years after her operation. So the operation was in 1991. Sabom read about the details of her experience in 94, and then I think he went to interview her. I don't know when Pam Reynolds first reported her near-death experience. It's quite possible that she did mention it the day afterwards. However, the real issue is not when she first reported having a near-death experience. The important thing is when she first reported the specific details that are alleged to be veridical. This is such an obvious point that, of course, Sabom, as a great skeptic that he is, doesn't mention this. And I know he only has a few minutes to talk about this here, although I feel like they could have used more of their time to go over this very important case. But the point is, if you're a genuine skeptic, you go through things carefully and in the appropriate amount of detail, right? So the key issue here is that there are a few details that are alleged to have been reported by Pam Reynolds, but could not have been known by Pam Reynolds through ordinary sensory means like sight and sound, such as the shape of the saw and what it looked like, the layout or appearance of the other surgical instruments, and in particular, a conversation between some of the doctors. So anything else that she reports that's not part of what can be verified or has been verified isn't relevant for this. I mean, it's sort of relevant to understand the whole case, but it's not relevant from the point of view of establishing whether she could have known through this through other means, right? The question is, did she report these details one day afterwards? And as far as I've been able to tell, the answer is no, or at least I've not seen evidence to the effect that she did report these details one day afterwards, or that that's documented. And honestly, anything longer than that is problematic, especially if she is reporting, if she did report that experience a day afterwards, because as soon as she talks to any of the doctors or nurses or other people involved, they may provide her with information that she can then, I'm not saying this is conscious, although possible it is, but it's more likely that it's an unconscious process of memory distortion. One very well-known effect is source amnesia, so people forget where they learned some information, and people very readily contaminate memories with information they find out afterwards. So if she had some vague recollection or vague sense of a sore or being cut or something like that, which of course she knew was going to happen. And she reports this as part of her experience. And then she may have been told what the sore looks like, or maybe someone even showed it to her, or she found out about it later through other means. I mean, you have no idea, right? You don't know because it's not controlled. And if Sabom talked to her 3 years afterwards, then there's been heaps, and she's been talking about it in the interim, then there's been heaps of time for her to have accumulated the details and incorporated that into her memories, and report those. So if Sabom was a genuine skeptic, he'd want to try to trace that down and find when she started giving specific details and what the doctor said to her. That's going to be hard to do years after the fact, but you can at least try. And I've never found any of it. I have looked into this. Again, I can't remember if I've read Sabom's book or not. I've read some books on NDEs, but I don't remember which ones. I'd have to check. But I've not found anyone presenting evidence of this. If there is such evidence, I'd be very interested to look at it, because that is part of the story here about when she started giving these specific details and when she may have had access to that information. But absent that being controlled, then we can't rule out the much more mundane possibility that she simply found out this information after the fact. So that's sort of one obvious issue here. Another issue here is that Dr. Sabom mentioned that her Pam Reynolds had earbuds on and clicks produced in each ear. Now, this itself is kind of interesting, because Pam Reynolds didn't report hearing the clicks, and it's sort of unclear as to why you wouldn't hear the clicks if you were aware. And this is part of the problem about the near-death experiences. It's entirely unconstrained as to what the theory is supposed to be. Okay, well, let's say we couldn't explain it naturalistically. What's the alternative explanation? On what basis does someone who can't hear with their ears hear anything? What determines what they hear and what they don't hear? Why would she hear a conversation that's happening in the room, but not the clicks that are literally being emitted into her ears at that time? Why not a conversation in the next room or on the other side of the planet? Like, what's determining this? There doesn't seem to be any constraints on what the theory is actually explaining. So even if the naturalistic explanation fails, it is still highly unclear why, from any other point of view, she's hearing the conversation, but not the clicks or not something else. What determines this? Furthermore, the information I have indicates that in one ear she had a 90 or 95 decibel clicking sound. In the other ear, it was only 40 decibels. And 40 decibels is not that loud. A conversation in a room is about 60 decibels. So it would actually been quite possible for her to have heard over the that conversation, over the clicking in that ear. And that relates to the other explanation, which has been discussed by some skeptical commentators as well, including, just find the name of this guy. Yeah, Gerald Worley. I don't actually know how to say his name. But anyway, he hypothesizes, and it is, of course, a hypothesis, we can't know this, is that Pam Reynolds experienced an instance of anesthesia awareness. Now, this wouldn't have happened when she was under burst suppression, the technique they were using to flatline her EEG for the crucial part of the operation. But the whole operation was much longer than that. She was only under burst suppression for a short part of it. During other points in time, she may have experienced anesthesia awareness, which is not that uncommon. And because only one of her ears had the very high volume clicks in it, the other ear could have heard some of what was happening in the room, and potentially seen things as well. So that's another alternative explanation, which, note, is quite independent of the memory contamination issue. And they may have worked together. She may have had a dim recollection of certain things, which then reported to the physician, who then gave her additional details, which then she contaminated with her memory. So this is something like what I think plausibly happened. A combination of anesthesia awareness and memory contamination. Note that that is a hypothesis. I don't know that that happened, and there's not enough information to really confirm that. But I think it does fit the facts. It is consistent with background information about the rates of memory contamination, memory distortion, as well as amnesia awareness. And it explains why she heard certain things and not other things, like why she could hear part of a conversation. She wouldn't have been able to hear a conversation in a different room, because if it was through her ears, or it was through what the doctor said, that they would have occurred in the same room, right? So it kind of fits with that. By contrast, there's no real alternative explanation being provided here. Perhaps we'll get one over the course of the video. I don't want to preempt anything by trying to guess what explanation Sabom might give, because there's all sorts of different things that you'll hear. So I'm not going to say anything until I actually hear something. But at the moment, I think we have a plausible naturalistic explanation, or at least a hypothesis that fits the facts, a combination of anesthesia awareness and memory distortion. Bearing in mind that the things that she reported did not necessarily occur during the burst suppression phase. As far as I can tell, they didn't, but I don't know that we have precise enough records to be certain about that. In addition, even if some of the things that she reports did occur during the phase when her EEG was 0, then there's also the possibility of that information to have been provided after the fact by doctors involved, especially if she is giving reports of some vague details that she was able to find out about as a result of anesthesia awareness. So I think that we do have sufficient outlines of an explanation here, and that fits with all the facts that have been given by Sabom here. Obviously, there's more details to it, but I'm not going to get too distracted by the Pam Reynolds case. Now, someone makes a good point here that NDEs are not evidence that Christianity is one true religion. Well, we haven't even gotten to the afterlife yet. So NDEs may be evidence of something abnormal happening, or something that can't be explained naturalistically. We have to first get to that level. If we get there, then maybe we'll get some alternative explanation which somehow links us to an afterlife. I don't know how we're going to get there. We haven't had any explanation of that. Cameron just sort of threw in the afterlife from nowhere. Maybe we'll get an explanation as to how we go from NDEs being puzzling to evidence of the afterlife. Then if we get to evidence of the afterlife, then only then might we go to, well, could this be evidence for the existence of God? Note that afterlife does not entail God. We could have some kind of afterlife, immortal spirits, whatever, and there be no God. So we can't take that leap without further evidence or argument there. And then if we get to God, well, then Christianity, I don't know how we're going to get there just on NDEs alone. You'd probably say that it's a cumulative case or whatever. So the point is that there's at least like 4 steps that we have to get this to be an argument for Christianity. And we're struggling on the first step. The first step is, can we find high quality evidence that there's something outside of the norm, outside of what can naturalistically be explained using kind of known psychological and biological mechanisms? We're struggling with that point yet. And that's only the first of at least like 4 steps. So let's hear what else Sabom has to say.
This case has been examined and criticized for multiple internationally. I mean, this is a very well-known case, and it, like I say, it's
the best well-known case,
showing that there is actually something there that cannot be explained with normal scientific methods.
Well, how do skeptics usually
see? Remember that Sabom previously said that he was skeptical about these phenomena when he started investigating them, but I would say that so far he hasn't shown really much of any skepticism. He didn't really tell us about how we can tell that this case is veridical. Cameron's about to ask about this, so perhaps we'll get more information.
Respond to cases like these?
Well, okay. Well, Susan Blackmore, there are two skeptics that have really taken this to heart. Susan Blackmore is a psychologist over in England, and she says that what these experiences are not happening at the time that the patient is fully.
I believe Susan Blackmore has had a near-death experience of her own. By the way, she's quite an interesting character.
Unconscious, but they're an emergent reaction to going in and coming out of the anesthesia itself. And this is where Pam's case blows that hypothesis apart, because her observations, her experience occurred in the middle of the surgery. The surgery was 6 hours. I think it's like 3 hours into the operation, she heard these things and saw these things happen. So she.
Oh dear. So we're not doing very well as a skeptic sub. First of all, I mean, I guess sometimes skeptics do talk about do speak in language like this, but if we're going to treat this seriously, we shouldn't use language like that's where this blows this apart. Okay, this explanation is provided that the memory of the report of what happened was the memory of what happened did not occur when the patient was actually unconscious. That's the claim here. Now, a single counterexample can't blow that apart because it could explain other cases, even if it may be inapplicable in the case of Pam Reynolds. Maybe it's applicable in other cases. We'd have to see how often that explanation may be appropriate. But okay, let's put that aside and think about the Pam Reynolds case. Blowing apart is, I think, rather imprecise language. How plausible is that as an explanation of the Pam Reynolds case? I would suggest that that's a better way to phrase it, the plausibility of it as an explanation. So the question there is, what time during the operation did the details reported by Pam Reynolds occur? And was that when she was under burst depression, like 0 EEG, like when she was, when it's impossible, presumably, that she could have been conscious? I say presumably because it's also known that EEG is not a very sensitive measure of consciousness, and that there is some questions about whether that's a sufficient measure of unconsciousness. But let's put that aside for the moment. Now, I do have the documentation on this here. I'm just sort of looking at it now, but I don't actually know if the evidence is actually sufficient to know. Well, okay, so the issue with seeing the saw is that we don't know when she may have seen that. She didn't necessarily have to have seen that when it was being used on her. Also, typically, the opening up of the skull is going to occur at a different time to when the suppression is actually going to occur. I'm not sure if we actually have the details of that here. The whole operation, as you said, was about 6 or 7 hours long, and she's only under burst suppression of that for a short amount of time. I'm trying to see if I can find the actual number here. Unfortunately, the reference that I have is quite waffly. I don't see it. I don't think I can actually find the specific number. Oh, here it is. So the duration of the infusion leading to that was about 105 minutes. So it is only a short portion, as he's saying. So the other question is, seeing the saw, could she have seen the saw at a different time than when she was under burst suppression? It seems eminently plausible that she could have. And I seem to recall that it's actually likely that she would have, but I can't find the details of that here. Of course, Sabom's not presenting them, so it's sort of hard to say. The other thing, of course, is the conversation. Now, we haven't really heard any details about this, and I've struggled to find. I remember another thing that Pam Reynolds reported hearing was the radio playing, but that one we can verify because that occurred right near the end of the operation. They turned on the radio, and so she was coming. It's extremely plausible that she was coming to awareness as the radio was on. So he hasn't mentioned that here, but that's one that I think is quite easily explained. As for the conversation, I just don't know the specifics of that. The issue is, did that conversation that she allegedly heard occur when she was under the burst suppression? Unless that can be verified, then we don't really have much of substance here. Even if it can be verified, it's still not clear whether Pam found out about that conversation afterwards. Again, all you have to have is Pam to experience some degree of anesthesia awareness outside of the burst suppression period, report that to the physicians afterwards. They become intrigued and then mention to her something that they said, which then Pam mixes up with her memories and stores as part of what she remembers having heard herself, even though actually the doctors reported that. This is extremely common, that people misremember the source of information and combine information that they've received as a report after the fact with their own memory. So I'd need to have detailed evidence about exactly the timing of things, but even if that conversation did occur during burst depression, that still unfortunately doesn't rule out that Pam could have simply been told it by the doctors afterwards. So what we have is just not enough controls available to rule out pretty ordinary explanations here. And that's why people like me just aren't convinced. I don't know how Sabom thinks that such explanations are blown out of the water by simply claiming that because she was under burst depression for part of the operation, that therefore it's impossible that she could have either had the experience during a different part of the operation or found out about it afterwards from information provided by the physician. I'd be very interested as to how Sabom would respond to that.
She wasn't coming in and out of anesthesia. That explanation just went out the window. Now, Dr. Gerald Worley, who's a German
yeah, so that's who I was mentioning. He pronounces it Worley. I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced. Anyway,
anesthesiologist, he's written a book about these experiences, and he explains. Hold on to your seat. He explains that Pam heard this conversation. The sound waves that were created when Spethler was talking to the cardiovascular surgeon were transmitted through the operating room table, through the three-pronged metal device that was holding her head still, through her brain, and then she heard that conversation like that, like you and I talking, and the vibrations from our sound waves from our mouth during the conversation created all of that. He came up with it. This has never been proven by anybody. To me, I think it's absolutely absurd. But he came up with it as the only possible way to explain how Pam could have heard this without hearing it from out of her body the way she said she did. So that's where we've gotten to with the Pam Reynolds case, and it remains the best case that we have so far.
So my understanding was that Worley actually proposed that the sound was transmitted through her jaw, but maybe that was different. Maybe he was talking about the sound of the drill was transmitted through the jaw and through the bones, which would sort of connect to bones in the ear. That I think has a certain plausibility to it, although I don't know that you're going to be able to hear a conversation like that. I haven't read enough of Worley's work I'm not sure that that's an entirely fair characterization, but Worley does say something to the effect that the sound was transmitted kind of through her, conducted through the bones in her skull or cranium or something. Now, I'm not sure about that myself. I think it's probably more plausible to say that either the conversation took place at a different time or that she just heard about it afterwards and then, confabulated it, having seen it. Again, I can't find in the document that I have exactly what time during the operation the conversation is supposed to have occurred, but perhaps it was supposed to have occurred during the burst depression phase. Anyway, the point I wanted to make here has already been preempted by one of my viewers here, which is the really strange double standards here. Okay, so on the one hand, we're going to say, look, this explanation about transmitting the sound through bone and so forth, this is kind of implausible. This isn't really something that's been demonstrated. It's a bit ad hoc. So we should be kind of skeptical about that. And, I kind of agree that sounds like a bit of a stretch to me. Okay, well, what's the alternative explanation that we're going to say is better than that? We don't necessarily have to have an alternative, but the problem is these guys are saying that there is an alternative, right? That's the whole point of them propagating this, is that they say that there's a better explanation. Well, what is that? Well, allegedly, it's like you have an immaterial soul which left your body and then heard stuff somehow, even though it's immaterial. So I don't know how it can interact with physical sound waves, but then it went back into the body and then somehow transmitted that information to your brain, but didn't hear the clicking sounds in the ear for some strange reason. What the hell is this? How is this any better? That's even more speculative. At least we know that bone can conduct sound and that there's some sort of plausibility there. Okay, it's a bit hand wavy, whatever, but it's certainly more plausible than whatever the hell Sabom and Cameron seem to be implying here, that there was an actual immaterial out of body experience, whatever. Like, it's sort of, again, we don't really get any details. Maybe we will later, but I kind of doubt that. So it's this sort of double standard here. Bone conducting sound, this has never been proven, as opposed to whatever it is that you're peddling, which has been proven, which is less speculative. I don't understand how someone can actually take themselves seriously when, on the one hand, they scoff at a speculative explanation like Worley proposed, but then also just sort of unironically, on the other hand, offer these wildly more speculative explanations, which have even less basis for them. I just don't get that at all. Again, I'd be very interested to hear how he justifies that, like throwing out something as being ridiculous while then embracing something that's even more ridiculous and even less well attested, like medically or scientifically.
Of this sort of situation.
I've also heard a story. I can't remember the details. This is not an area that I've personally done much research into, but there was one case
Despite the fact that you're interviewing the guy, like, how many videos does Cameron put out a month? Didn't they just recently reduce the number that they put out so they could be higher quality? Well, surely he could spend like a week reading up on this or a day reading up on this and have some reasonable things to say. I don't know. Maybe he did, and this is what we got. But it's just, that seems a bit of a cop out to me.
Maybe you know of it. There was this. I can't remember even if it was a man or a woman, but they noticed some writing on some medical equipment on like top of a shelf, and they from their perspective, they couldn't even get up there and see that. Are you familiar with any cases like that?
Vaguely. And this brings up another important point. One of the most important aspects of this research is documentation.
Yeah.
Third-party documentation, medical records, eyewitness reports, etc. And if you don't have documentation and you say you heard this from a nurse who said this because the patient said blah, 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 I mean, that's not documentation. And I'm very critical about this because as a physician, if it's what they say about medical records, if it's not written down in the medical record, it didn't happen. That's how important the record is to these cases. And if you can't document them or you have not documented them, then, but they're accepted by the public in a written book. And we've got lots of them. A lot of Christians have had very powerful near-death experiences and sold millions of books and movies, and people buy them and believe them. And when they're asked, well, was there anybody else there? Do you have any doctors or EMT people or medical records or anything? No, it's, trust me, it happened. And if they're a Christian authority stating such an experience happened to them, and that experience the Christian authority is claiming is a trip to the afterlife, then they're accepting something that has not been shown to have really happened by anything other than the word of mouth opinion of the person who had the experience. There's no documentation that it.
What sort of documentation can establish that someone went to the afterlife? This guy just doesn't seem to. I mean, I agree with the point about documentation, but just because there's documentation saying that a procedure happened and that the person reported having experienced something during that procedure, nothing whatever follows about any afterlife. First, we have to establish whether there's any way that the experience could have been caused by sort of known psychological and sociological factors, and that could explain the reports that we have. If we exhaust those, then we can be in a position of, well, we can't explain through normal, natural, psychosocial means as to how it happened. Maybe we can consider alternative explanations, and I'm open to hearing those. I don't still know where afterlife comes into this because these people haven't died, so they're not going to any afterlife place because they're still alive, and no documentation can tell us anything about what the afterlife is like. So it feels like he's sort of got the first step, but it is really sort of missing how we then put the pieces together to try to actually get a cogent case for the afterlife, which I think is what they want. So yeah, documentation is necessary, but it's by no means sufficient. There's a lot more that we need in addition.
So I'm very strict on that. And as a cardiologist, I must admit, I'm in a privileged position because I'm often there at the time of the cardiac arrest, and I have access to the third-party documentation. So I'm not blaming other people, but when they refuse to release documentation about it.
Well, that does bring up an interesting question. So when it comes to, remind me the name of the woman that we were just discussing.
Oh my God. Okay. There's no way that Cameron did serious preparation for this, because if he did, like, how could he have even read the guy's book and not know about Pam Reynolds? Pam Reynolds is the most widely documented, best documented, I don't know if it's necessarily the best documented, but it's certainly the most widely discussed and well-documented NDE cases. You just should know that if you're preparing for a discussion about NDEs with a guy who, interviewed her and wrote about it in his book and so forth. How can he not even remember that? Oh, unless he's talking about Susan Blackwell.
Right. Oh, Pam Reynolds.
Pam Reynolds. So with respect to her case, I mean,
he was talking about Pam. I was like, what are you doing, Cameron? Isn't this your job? I do this as a hobby when I can find the time, alongside doing a PhD and, being involved in effective altruism. Yeah. And other stuff. I mean, I don't know, Cameron has a family and whatever, but like the point is that this is poor showing, right? Like, to not even know the most important case, which is brought up in the discussion. And he seems to have never heard of it before, or barely heard of it before. He must have heard of it before, because I'm pretty sure Habermas has talked to him about it before on this program. Anyway, I think that's kind of poor showing by Cameron. Like, how can he really do a good job as an interviewer when he's not familiar with this?
mean, what we have in her case, and maybe you can just let me know, like, do you think that this qualifies as scientific evidence that we've got from because what we have in essence is testimony that is then backed up or sort of corroborated with other existing facts, like this conversation that was occurring between the doctor and the nurse. So, but what we have is testimony in that case. And we also have the testimony of the assisting physician that was there that heard her story. So it could be the case that, that the testimony from the assistant neurosurgeon is incorrect, or was, he was making that up. So,
okay. So that then that's his testimony. Then we have the written medical records from the chief neurosurgeon, Spetzler. We have the written medical records of the cardiovascular surgeon. We have the medical records of the technician who is hooking her up with these things in her ears. So I mean, at some point, you're right. You could concoct. This is a probability. I mean, and
what's a probability?
It comes down to what do you consider legitimate legal evidence? And
we said anything about legal evidence? So it's a scientific evidence. The rules are different there. It feels like, I don't know, maybe this is just because he's trained in medicine or something. I don't know. I don't know that that's a fair characterization. It's like he understands the importance of documentation and evidence in an abstract sense, but he doesn't know how to put it together. The point is not that do we have lots of documents, do we have written testimonies of so-and-so? The point is, what is the claim and what is the evidence for that claim, and how can we rule out alternative hypotheses? This is a key element to the scientific process, and I mean, it should be in legal and historical process as well. I think there's a continuity there, but what you want is, here's the facts. We try to establish the facts. Then we develop an explanation for the facts, a hypothesis, and then we compare contrasting hypothesis and see whether they fit with the evidence, what predictions they would make, or what other evidence we might bring to bear to try to assess that, how plausible it is on our background evidence. You bring in all of these aspects. And he just isn't doing that. Like, he's not clear about what the document is supposed to be supporting. Like, you can have documents saying that they did all these things with Pam Reynolds, but none of that's really going to be relevant unless it bears on the specific question as to how did she get the information about what the saw looked like, or what someone said during the operation, or whatever the things that she's allegedly knew but not supposed to have known. Unless the documentation directly bears on that question, then it's not really that relevant. I mean, I guess basic, you want to establish basic things like she was actually there when she reports to and so forth, but that is documented, sure. But the specifics of it, like what time during the operation did this conversation occur? Can we establish that very definitively? Can we definitively ensure that she had 0 EEG at that time? Do we know if any of those people spoke to her after the operation, and could they have revealed information about this? Could she have seen the bone saw during a time when she wasn't under 0 EEG, or even like before or after the operation? Sometimes, I guess they won't normally show you that sort of thing before the operation, but maybe afterwards, or if she mentioned it. I mean, who knows, right? Unless we have documentation about this, we don't really know. And he's not being careful about describing in what way the documentation supports the core claims. He's just sort of mentioning it in a general sense. It feels like Habermas does this as well. Like, Habermas loves lists and accumulating long documents and examples of things without being careful in establishing what claims they actually support and how they rule out alternative hypotheses. And I don't know if this is a general thing about sort of this type of Christian apologetics, or maybe it's just a human failing. I don't know, but it's sort of frustrating when there's an appeal to evidence in general, but a lack of specificity and clarity about how the evidence supports the claim and how alternative hypotheses are ruled out.
If you have all these sources from different people and you see no reason why they should be lying or making it up, at some point you have to.
Well, notice that in case of Pam Reynolds, in cases like Pam Reynolds, that there is a reason for people to at least embellish. I don't know if some doctors who treat people like this go on to write books about it and make money about it. I don't know if that's true in the Pam Reynolds case, but I know that's been true in other cases. I'd have to look at my records, but that's definitely happened. And also the people in question often go on to give interviews and write books or have books written about them. So it's not like there's no incentive. Now, I'm not saying that leads people to make it up out of whole cloth, but you don't have to think in this binary way. I know that Christians love to think it's like completely true or and honest, or it's entirely fabricated. But the human condition is usually somewhere in between. It's like, this thing happened, but there's an incentive for me to embellish. So maybe I just sort of allow myself to not think too critically about it and, embellish the report slightly as time goes on. Everyone does this to various extents, right? But it's usually not about something like this. Honestly, all we need, I think, for this to happen is a little bit of memory contamination plus a little bit of embellishment over time. And that explains the effect, because the effect is so subtle. It's like seeing things and hearing things that she couldn't have known quite at the time, but could have easily been reported to her afterwards. So all you need is a little bit of contamination, a little bit of embellishment, and there you have it. Like the effect is explained. If the effect is small, then the explanation only also needs to be small. If what she reported was more impressive, such as a long string of numbers that was not visible to anyone but her at the top of a machine or something like that, and there are reports of that sort, but they're not well documented. Like that would require more of an explanation. But the point is that the more subtle the effect is, like seeing a sword that you probably couldn't have, but could have easily been shown to her afterwards, or have it described to her afterwards. Like that only needs a subtle effect. So we need to balance what's being claimed against what is needed to explain. I don't need to postulate anyone being out and out liar, like villainous liar, or any kind of conspiracy or anything like that in order to explain this effect. I just need a little bit of self-deception and a lack of critical thinking. And it's not like that's in either of those things is in short supply in this world.
Say the evidence is still evidence, but it's enough to make a conclusion that beyond a reasonable doubt that
really
happened the way it
beyond
did.
Reasonable doubt. Do you think that does Saban think he could establish this in a court of law? There's no way he could establish this in a court of law beyond reasonable doubt. The documentation is not sufficient to establish the claim that she experienced these things and didn't find out about them afterwards. There's no way he'd be able to do that. I'm just shocked that he would say beyond reasonable doubt. It's one thing to say it's evidence, and maybe even persuasive, but beyond reasonable doubt is a pretty high standard. There's no way he could establish that beyond reasonable doubt.
But you're using the word evidence, and that is a very good word to use. It's not proof.
So I'm just going to skip through a bit because this discussion about evidence is boring.
Well, I wonder if there's a connection that could be made. Maybe there are like certain people that are a little bit more credible than others. So like in the case of Reynolds, like she seems like a very credible witness if what she reported accurately represented what was going on in that medical room. And so maybe the fact that there are other corroborative facts surrounding her case, at least in the autoscopic portion, maybe that can then sort of transfer her credibility to the experience that she had in the supernatural realm or whatever. Do you see see that connection?
Yes, I sure do. And I think that's because what actually she had.
Pam Reynolds didn't have any experiences in the supernatural realm. What we have is experiences in the ordinary realm, just of hearing things or seeing things that she allegedly couldn't have. So all we need is a mechanism to transfer that information to her without appeal to any supernormal means. And I think I've already provided two possibilities. And if you don't like any of those, I think the bone conduction explanation is still better than anything Saban's got.
A transcendental experience. She had three elements of her experience. She had the out-of-body part, and then she had a transcendental part where she went down a tunnel, saw a light, met several of her deceased relatives, and then came back and saw autoscopically again when they were resuscitating her after they had stopped her heart and brought her back to life, so to speak, or brought her heartbeat back. So
note that that's an important distinction. They didn't bring her back to life. Maybe she was clinically dead, but that's not really important. Unless you think, unless you think that the basis of whether you go to the afterlife is based on clinical death, and they kind of, oh yes, come in. Oh wait, no, your heartbeat's again. We're going to kick you out. That's rather silly. But the point is, she didn't actually die, right? So how is she going to the afterlife? How does that supposed to work? That doesn't really make any sense. Yes, I agree. He just sort of waffles about, well, there's documents, but doesn't really explain why is the evidence sufficient to corroborate or establish the claim against alternative hypotheses. That's what you need to establish. And people like Saban here they can't do that. They just waffle on about their documents or, well, how credible is eyewitness testimony or whatever, when that's not really even the issue. So I've got to finish up pretty soon. I just want to hear what they have to say. Maybe I'll do a part 2 at some point and cover, because there is another video that I wanted to cover on near-death experiences actually. But I want to hear what they have to say about the afterlife.
Pretty reasonable. But another move that you could make is you could forward a different hypothesis that says that there is at least one, near-death experience that is veridical, something along those lines, and that then would be supported by the evidence that there is at least, this one case of Reynolds. Like she provides, I think, fairly good evidence in support of at least, that some people have these experiences and some of them are veridical. If that's the
veridical of what? What does that mean?
Supported by the evidence.
Veridical meaning corresponding to the truth. But what is the truth? Like, there's so much weasel word here. Like what they see, I know I skipped a bit, but I don't think I skipped something that was crucial here because, based on what they've said, and also based on what I've heard people say elsewhere, they just don't. They have Cameron, Saban, and others who talk about this. They don't give any plausible explanation. Not even plausible. They don't give an alternative explanation. What actually happened? Give us an explanation, and then we can assess it for plausibility and fit with the facts. But until you do, we just don't have anything here.
Okay.
How can you say it's veridical when we haven't established what it's supposed to be
at the front of what you were just saying about the afterlife? Again, everybody has, I believe, and this is biblical. We're talking. This is where science meets religion. Okay, and some things that science.
How much for being skeptical? This apparently is what he believed all along.
Science cannot explain. There is an answer in Scripture. Okay, so if you don't believe in Scripture, then you're left. What happened? I don't know. But we're not.
What does Scripture have to do with it?
Absence of it.
The Scripture doesn't say anything about near-death experiences, as far as I know. So how do we go from someone hearing a conversation that they probably shouldn't have through normal means to the Bible? What the hell is the connection between those? Can we have a few links, please, to tell us why we should draw from one to the other?
Afterlife or life after death. We're talking about the presence or absence of remembering an experience that happened during the dying process prior to final physical death.
No. It didn't happen. How many times do I have to say this to a medical doctor? The experience didn't happen during the dying process. It happened during a near-dying process, but not actually dying. That's kind of important, right? Why would they leave their spirit leave their body when they're not actually dead? Surely that only happens when you actually die, right? Not when you nearly die, unless God just kind of, I don't know, he's just kind of lazy. It's like, oh, they're close enough to death. Let's just, let's just get it over with, just pull them out here and send them wherever they're going. And then they actually get resuscitated. It's like, oh, I guess we'll have to send you back. Like that happens in every, these silly comedy movies or sitcoms or whatever, where someone nearly dies and then God or Peter at the pearly gates is, just like reluctantly allows them to return. Like, is that seriously the explanation here? They are not actually dead. They didn't die. Why is it that we're talking as if they did die?
Afterlife comes about. So it's the before experience that we're talking about here. It's not the after. It's entirely possible that if you're not a Christian and you don't that
what does Christian have to do with this?
Very detailed near-death experience, and then when final physical death comes, there's nothing. I can't say that doesn't happen, except that's not my Christian biblical belief. So I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but we're not talking about afterlife here. We're talking about before life experience.
So he agrees with you. So none of this has anything to do with the afterlife. So let's stop talking about it and let's ask, what is his explanation for what happens? Now, maybe he doesn't have one. He doesn't have to have an explanation. It could be that the naturalistic explanations are not satisfactory, but he doesn't have an alternative. And that's fine, right? But that's not how this is being peddled, and that's not how this is presented in the discourse. And certainly Cameron is implying that this is evidence for the afterlife, and others claim this. I don't know if Sabam claims this explicitly. Maybe he'll be clearer.
And this is another quandary here. You can have near-death like experiences. For instance, general anesthesia. A lot of times a person can have an out-of-body like experience and look at what's going on in the operating room, but not be near death. So it can happen in other situations too. So we don't have the final word on this, but again, I believe that it commonly.
So it's interesting there that being nearly dead is not a requirement for having a near-death experience, or at least elements of that, like an out-of-body experience. I think that casts doubt on whether being near death has anything to do with it, and it's more to do with altered states of consciousness, which is a thoroughly naturalistic explanation, I would argue. But anyway,
it does occur, or seems to occur, in the dying process prior to final physical death.
But how do you know it occurs during the dying process when the people haven't died? It's just the same point comes up again. It's like he kind of knows this, but then forgets about it the next sentence.
To one of the topics we spoke about briefly, and you mentioned general revelation, how these experiences are usually consistent with general revelation, which what you meant by that is that they're consistent with this sort of general concept of there being a God. And usually, from what I understand, it's like a God of love, or some, this loving being at the end.
Yeah.
Well, are there any specific?
Oh, because people experience the feeling of it. Well, not everyone do. Some people experience have very negative experiences during near-death experiences. I think they're more often positive, but some people have negative experiences of like fear and foreboding and things like that. I think I did read a survey on that at one point, but I can't remember the details. But anyway, I mean, that's not going to be evidence of anything, of course, because it's likely that someone is going to have experiences that draw upon their beliefs and cultural expectations. Even if they are not themselves a Christian, they are likely familiar with Christian iconography. And that's true for pretty much everyone in the world at this point. Maybe in some very isolated societies that wouldn't be true. But I mean, even Muslims and Hindus, many of them believe in God anyway, or some form of God. So there's a connection with the divine to love, and that's true in Buddhism as well. So I don't really know how some general sense of a spiritual existence or a God or a higher power and feelings of love and comfort. That's pretty general across most religions in the world in one degree or another. I don't really understand how that's supposed to be evidence of anything, because that could just as well have come from their psychology. And again, they don't have to be a believer themselves. They could just have that as something that's part of their subconscious. Like I don't have to believe in something to have a dream about it or a hallucination about it or a near-death experience about it. So I don't know how that's supposed to be evidence for anything.
Characteristics of, say an experience that happened in India that had specific characteristics that were unique to the Hindu religion that would therefore be inconsistent with, say, the Christian story. Are there any accounts like that are inconsistent with the Christian story?
Yes. The identity, the interpretation of the light, which some people think is God, of a Hindu and a Christian, the interpretation of that is consistent with the religious beliefs of the person who had the experience. The interpretation,
yeah, that's what I've read.
But the presence of it is similar. It's called a core near-death experience. The presence of the elements are similar, but the interpretation of the elements by the person is dependent upon the background of the person involved.
Which is exactly what you'd expect under a naturalistic hypothesis, by the way. If God was somehow revealing something to people during this experience, then he could show all sorts of things that are outside of their cultural context that they couldn't otherwise have known. I mean, I guess when people started talking about it, then they would hear about it. But the point is, if you're God, like, you can kind of do a lot. So if he wanted to, he could make it much more impressive than currently it is, which is like, there's a light and I feel comforted and there's some kind of afterlife. All my relatives are there and they'll greet me. Not everyone experiences this, but a lot of people do. I mean, how is that shocking under a naturalistic explanation? How do we, why are we treating this as if like this is some big revelation?
Hindu, Christian, Buddhist, whatever.
Well, so maybe to be more specific, has a Hindu person had an experience of like Vishnu or some other like goddess or god in their sort of transcendental aspect of their experience? Are there any cases like those, which would seem to contradict the Christian story? Are there any like specific? Because like in some of the Christian examples,
story?
You have like people.
What's the Christian story? We haven't heard any story. I only skipped a little bit there, but I don't think that they talk. Maybe at the end of this, we might revisit this later to check if. But I don't think that they've explained what the story is supposed to be. What's supposed to have happened under a Christian explanation?
Seeing relatives or people, Christ leading them from like hell to heaven, and so it seems fairly plausible that a Hindu person might experience something like Vishnu or one of the other thousands of gods that they've got in their religion. Has that occurred? If it hasn't occurred, then
yeah, I'm not familiar with that. I mean, I'm not that familiar with the Hindu religion, but I'm just saying that it's a God.
No, because why would we bother looking into that sort of thing, this cross-cultural study, which could actually potentially shed some light on this phenomenon? No, let's just look at studies in like the Anglosphere, where there's a common cultural heritage of Christian belief, which is where most of these studies have happened. Of course, there's a language barrier, which makes it difficult, and documentation is going to be hard to find. But the point is, many of the people who do these sorts of near-death or other types of like faith healings, actually, I think faith healings has more of an international focus, but even there, it's often in like evangelical Christian communities in Africa and stuff. And the point is that the avowed beliefs of skepticism and commitment to this don't match up with the actual actions, which would be, well, like, why don't we go and study this and try to actually raise some money to study it in a clearly non-Christian context and see how much they line up? I don't know if anyone's done that. I haven't seen any documentation about that or studies. If there are, I'd be very interested to hear about them. But this is the point, that most people don't really bother to do this, which I think is a shame, and maybe is something you'd expect a genuine skeptic to do if you were, trying to really test a phenomenon. But anyway.
For instance, let me just give you this one example of A.J. Ayer. He was an atheist. He was a very well-known atheist, and he had a near-death experience in the 1990s. And he went to another world, and he saw and met the master of the universe. Okay, but he was an atheist, and he refused to say he saw God, but he saw the master of the universe. And that was a personal choice of his own, because he didn't want to alienate all of his atheist friends by saying he met God or he saw God or there is a God. So but the master.
Well, is the master of the universe God? I mean, haven't you watched Star Trek or Doctor Who? The master of the universe could be a powerful alien. Like, I don't know what the master of the universe is if I met them. I mean, how do you know that's the God of the Bible? I don't even understand where this is. The point is, of course, people are going to interpret what they see through their own belief set and experiences, right? And you can't just say, well, they're denying that it was really God. But I mean, how do you know what they experienced? Maybe they did experience the master of the universe, who was not God. Like, what are we saying here? How do we know what they experienced?
Basically, a definition of God.
No,
in some way.
The master of the universe is not. That doesn't tell me anything. I guess they're powerful, some sort of being. I mean, how do we know that they are omnipotent, omniscient? Lacking a body, which is a normal understanding of God. It's just this thing Christians and other theists do where anything that sounds like God, they just call that God, even though they haven't actually established it has the right properties, and that could cause issues with the consistency with the explanation they're trying to peddle. But whatever.
And so the point is that,
me, yeah.
again, the presence of a supreme being, whatever you want to call it, can be placed in all of these different religions, and most likely, I'm sure there's an exception somewhere, but most likely they're going to
Let's get through the end of the
which
skeptics
is usually the light in view of their religious background that they have.
So yeah, I mean,
we could have been spending this time actually talking about the specifics of the Pam Reynolds case, which is much more interesting than this waffle about nothing really that doesn't establish anything.
I was going to go back to the question of the sort of skeptical objections to near-death experiences, although I think we've pretty much covered that. Are there any other?
Well, no, not really. Barely said anything. But the objection is not to the experiences. No one objects to the experiences. We have an alternative explanation as to the cause of the experiences. And so far, I haven't heard any explanation of the cause of these experiences from Cameron or Sabom. All we've got is very vague references to the Bible and the afterlife. Is that all they have to offer? Extremely vague hand-waving about the Bible and the afterlife?
Very popular or common objections that skeptics will raise against, say, the Reynolds case or any of these other like highly evidential cases?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I've heard that there are people, that the brain activity that occurs right before death and the brain activity that occurs right after they, or right after they come back,
death.
like that brain activity can be used to explain the crazy vivid experiences that they, allegedly had. What about something along those lines?
Well, we're now getting Andrew Newberg, who's a neuroradiologist, and he's done functional MRIs on people in meditations and stuff like that. And he makes a point, and other people made the point, that when you see some activity in the brain at the same time as they're having a near-death experience, you don't know whether the activity is causation or correlation. In other words, is that brain activity correlated with? Let me back up here.
I don't think anyone's done fMRI on someone who's having a near-death experience. I don't see how that could possibly be ethical. He spoke about meditation. That's not a near-death experience. I mean, maybe you could have an out-of-body experience, I suppose. That might have been studied. I'm not aware of that. But what he's saying makes no sense. I mean, you can't resuscitate someone if they're in an fMRI machine. And you're not going to be recording the blood oxygen level response in the brain when their heart is not beating. That doesn't really make any sense. So kind of by definition, you're going to have heart flow to the blood flow to the brain in order to measure a bold response to get an fMRI signal. So I think he's kind of mixing things up a bit here. You can't do fMRI of someone who has no measurable brain activity, kind of by definition, right?
Here, let me use the example of a radio. Okay, a radio plays music. Okay, and if you go and smash the radio, it no longer plays music. But do you smash, in the process of smashing the radio, do you then smash the music, the source of the music? No, that's the channel or the radio station that is coming from. In other words, the brain can be, it's now thought to be by most people, a transmission device or organ and not a causative organ. So the brain waves can reflect or correlate with, but they don't cause the actual music or whatever image that you're talking about. Does that make sense? Correlation versus causation?
All right. Well, I think we'll leave that there. We've just heard from a doctor that the brain doesn't actually cause psychological function, including vision and sound. It's just a mere reflector, I think he said, or receiver of what we don't know. He didn't say. That's an interesting hypothesis. I wonder if he'll write that up in a medical journal for us. Anyway, I've got to go, and that's about as much dumb as I can take for one day. Yeah, there's much better sources to look at on near-death experience. They're an interesting phenomenon. I don't think we need to postulate any spooky metaphysics going on to explain them. But we also should be wary of postulating any single explanation to account for them, because there's a wide range of experiences. There are commonalities and differences, so we shouldn't assume that there's only one explanation. And we've got to look at the specifics of each case. Anyway, that was really disappointing, actually. It was even worse than I thought it was. But I think because there is interest here, I might do another a follow-up video where maybe we'll just look at a couple of bits there that we missed, and then there's another stream. I think Dr. Sean McDowell did one recently as well on near-death experiences, and maybe he'll be better at actually trying to articulate what this has to do with Christianity, which would be nice to hear from Christian apologists who presumably think this tells us something about, God or Jesus. But we didn't actually hear anything about that other than extremely vague references to the afterlife or the Bible, which is just pathetic, to be honest. I mean, that whole interview was just pathetic. There was very little of substance there. All right. I hope that sated your strange desire to hear more apologetics nonsense. I'll try to get another of these videos out. I know this was a bit of a short one today. I'll try to do one in a few weeks. I do have a few other commitments, as I've said, but I haven't forgotten about you guys, so don't worry. The videos will keep coming. It just sometimes it takes a while. All right. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.